This book I wrote about Japan's role in the world, role in the Indo-Pacific, Japan's grand strategy under Abe Shinzo, before I knew I'd be moving to Australia. And I wrote the book because Abe, in his unprecedented 8-year tenure as prime minister, really transformed Japan, at least Japanese foreign and security policy, and probably had more impact on Japan's role in the world than any Japanese leader since Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, who was the great architect of Japan's post-war recovery and re-entry into international society. So he was a truly transformational figure. And I knew that certain officials in the US government, a handful of Japan scholars understood this, but I wanted to make sure that I could contribute to scholarship to understand how profound the change was under Abe, what it means for the United States, what it means for the Indo-Pacific region, how enduring it is, but also to put some context around Abe himself. Abe was not uncontroversial. In his career, he contested the contested the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals. His grandfather, Kishi Nobusuke, was the Minister of Munitions in the puppet Manchukuo government. In some ways, he was a Japanese version of Albert Speer in Germany, but Albert Speer was purged. Abe's grandfather, Kishi, became prime minister. And so complicated views of history, some often controversial views on Japan's past earlier in his career. So a complicated but fascinating world figure. So the book was not meant to be a biography. And of course, I had no idea when I wrote it that, that Abe would be really bizarrely and tragically assassinated while on the campaign trail. But it does, I think, offer an explanation of Abe's times, of his own background, of Japan's history in Asia, and why this more really proactive Japan that we're seeing is here to stay. And that's why I wrote the book. I came to know Abe personally quite well. I worked in the Japanese Diet for a member of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party when I was a student at Tokyo University in the late 1980s. The member I worked for was one of the very few handful of Diet members who really understood security issues, which were so controversial still in Japanese politics. He understood defense planning. He even understood nuclear weapons. He was a nuclear physicist. His name was Shina, Shina Moto, family name Shina. And he was very close to Abe's father, who was a conservative politician, son of Prime Minister Kishi, himself foreign minister. So I came to really know Abe a bit later, but met him at that time. And I came to know him because when I was in the White House in the Bush administration on the staff of the National Security Council, first in charge of Japan and Korea and Australia, and then as the senior official covering everything from Afghanistan to Hawaii. During that period, Abe was in the Prime Minister's office in Japan. He was the Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary and then Cabinet Secretary. So in a sense, he was my counterpart. And I was the only person in the White House who spoke Japanese. President Bush developed a very close relationship with the then Prime Minister, Koizumi Junichiro. And so I had frequent telephone and in-person conversations with Abe, coordinating policies, conveying messages on behalf of the two leaders, on everything from whaling to trade, to even some of Abe's thinking about the Yasukuni Shrine and Japan's history, all of which was of interest to President Bush. And the president encouraged me to have an ongoing dialogue with Abe, in part because we knew he'd be prime minister one day and be of great consequence. So I came to know him. His public persona evolved over time. When he first was prime minister in 2006 and 2007, he was considered a bit of a right-wing, hawkish, almost ideological leader. When he came back to power in 2012, A bit of that remained, but he was now seen as something more of a pragmatic leader and strategist. His public persona evolved, but I came to know him as a person, and a very warm human being, very loyal to his friends, sometimes a little tough on his enemies, but a very decent person, and very well liked and respected in the Japanese government, by the bureaucracy, by business leaders. He managed to get on well with President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump. In fact, he was one of the few world leaders who really was able to manage President Trump. He was often referred to as the Trump whisperer, and leaders from Canada and Britain often consulted with Abe on how he managed Donald Trump, which we can get into if you like. So he had a very engaging, warm personality. It was and I knew his wife, and a true shock and tragedy when he was killed. So I'm gratified that the world media and scholars are starting to think about his legacy. But the point of the book is that while Abe was the change agent, structure in international relations matters, structure in history matters. And much of the transformation Abe brought to Japan's role in the world had deep roots in Japanese history and had bipartisan precedents leading up to his own time in office. So let me tell you a bit about the book and about Japan's grand strategy and Japan's role in Asia and the world. I wrote a book that I published in 2017 about American grand strategy. I'd worked in the White House for 5 years. I wrote presidential speeches. I wrote national security strategies, or as we joked in the Bush administration, strategery. And when I left, I was very interested in the historical evolution and roots and precedents and context for American strategic debates about the Indo-Pacific. So I wrote a quite long book. And one of the things I argued is that democracies have grand strategies. The word strategy comes from the Greek strategos, which literally means from the commander. And the American system of government is designed to have checks and balances against the concentration of power in the commander. And so the American way of strategy, I argued in my book, was messy and contested. It was a scrum. It was a meta process. Nevertheless, a grand strategy, responding to and reacting to challenges in the world, trying to safeguard American interests and values, even though those were contested and still are contested constantly. Democracies can have grand strategies. They're messy. They're not reflected in any one document or speech or doctrine per se, but as an international relations scholar and historian, I'm, I suppose, a realist and believe that states will pursue their interests. And while the process is messy and it's refracted through cultural experiences and particularly through the prism of particular leaders, democracies also have grand strategies. And Japan has had a grand strategy, or hasn't had a unique approach to the world since the oldest document I cite in my study, Nihon Koki, the Chronicles of Japan, in what would have been medieval history in Europe. So structure explains a lot of what Abe did, but Abe was the agent who brought it together and transformed Japan's strategy for securing its position and protecting its interests and its economy. So what was the strategy? Well, international relations theorists argue, for those who are IR majors, drawing on Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars and classical thinking about interstate relations, that when a state or a polity faces a rising power, a hegemonic power, a threat to its interests in the neighborhood, as Japan does with China, that state or polity has basically three options. One option is to just give up, what scholars call bandwagoning, to realign with the rising power. This was not an option that Japan has taken with the rise of China. Some Japan scholars in the 90s assumed that Japan, as it grew more powerful, would grow more independent of the United States, would converge with China, would be more Asian in its personality and detached from the US. As China became more powerful, some scholars argued that perhaps Japan would bandwagon with China, but it simply hasn't happened, and it would not be consistent with Japanese history. The Japanese have been competing with China as long as there has been recorded history. The first correspondence we know of between Japan and the imperial court, the Japanese prince Shoto, who introduced himself to the celestial emperor as the leader of the land of the rising sun and characterized China as the land of the setting sun. And there was allegory in there. And it was meant to declare to the celestial emperor that Japan was no less a power than China, even though, of course, Japan was much weaker than China. So Japan is the only other major civilization in Asia to have had an emperor consistently throughout history, like China until 1911. So the Japanese polity has always seen itself as competing in effect with China, not falling under Chinese hegemony, despite some periods of complicity with the trading state, tributary state system in the Muromachi period and so forth. So it wouldn't be consistent with Japanese strategic history, culture, geography to bandwagon the first choice for a state facing a rising power. The second choice a state has, and these are not all mutually exclusive, but the second choice a state has is what scholars call external balancing. In order to maintain autonomy, sovereignty in the international system, states can make alliances, can build partnerships. If there's not enough indigenous domestic strength for a country like Japan to maintain a favorable balance of power with a rising China, then the next best choice is to build stronger partnerships with other countries that also face challenges from China. And this external balancing has been, in some ways, the most significant part of Abe's grand strategy. And indeed, Japan's strategy since China began emerging as re-emerging as a major power, potentially the dominant power in Asia. So what does external balancing look like for Japan? Well, for Abe and for Japan, the most significant dimension was how the Japanese government in 2014 and 15 under Abe reinterpreted Japan's peace constitution. The Japanese post-war constitution declares in Article 9, the peace clause, that Japan renounces the right of war to resolve international disputes and will not maintain ground air or naval forces for that purpose. The Japanese government in various phases determined that, and the Japanese legal bureau, the government lawyers determined that Japan has the right of collective self-defense because that's enshrined in the UN Charter. That the members of the UN, including Japan, have the right to defend themselves against attack and engage in collective defense with other states similarly threatened. That's the basis for NATO, for example, collective defense, all for one and one for all. But the Japanese government said in the 50s, even though we have that right under the UN Charter, and it would be consistent with Japan's peace constitution, it would be inconsistent with the spirit, in effect, of the peace constitution to engage in collective defense, which, of course, in the pre-war period was used as an excuse by Japan, Germany, Italy, and imperial powers to invade other countries. So very controversial. And so the government said, we will not engage in collective self-defense. What that meant was that in the US-Japan security relationship, if Japan came under attack, the US committed to defend Japan. But if the US came under attack, Japan had no obligation whatsoever to help the United States. It was a one-sided treaty. That didn't matter when the US had the preponderance of power in the Pacific and was more focused on helping Japan recover economically as a bulwark against communism. But as Japan's economic power grew and as the threat from China grew, that became more of a liability. Japanese governments, Japanese mainstream political parties were very happy to have this ban on collective self-defense. It meant that when the US went into Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, the Japanese government could say to Washington, we'd love to help you with your little war in Vietnam, but the Constitution, which, by the way, your American lawyers wrote, leads us to believe that that simply would not be possible. And so collective self-defense became a kind of alibi, a get out of jail free card, an excuse for Japan to avoid engaging in any kind of joint operations or defense cooperation or collective security with the United States, with Korea, with Australia. This became very real for me when I was in the White House. I was working in the White House on 9/11 when terrorist attacks occurred in Washington and New York. And that night, the night of September 11th, I received a call from my boss saying that Britain and Australia had invoked our security treaties. Britain had invoked NATO, and Australia was going to invoke the Australia, New Zealand, US ANZUS Treaty, which has collective defense enshrined in it. An attack on any member is an attack on all members. And this was a very emotional moment in the White House. We were scared, we were under attack, we were sad. And here, two of our closest allies, Britain and Australia, called and said, under our treaties, we now will come to your defense. These treaties were designed for you to defend us, but we're now going to be there for you now they're under attack. So I was instructed to call the Japanese embassy, speak with the ambassador, and let him know that our two close allies, Britain and Australia, were going to be invoking our security treaties. And the embassy's response was, but we can't do that under our interpretation of the Constitution. And it went right to Prime Minister Koizumi and began a debate in Tokyo among experts about what to do and whether this was a liability. It was still very controversial, though. This was 2001. What convinced Abe, and ultimately allowed Abe to convince the Japanese Diet and the Japanese public to change the interpretation of collective self-defense, was that the Chinese challenge and the North Korean challenge was new. Previously, the Chinese Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard was not operating around the contested Senkaku Islands, administered by Japan, but claimed by China. The North Koreans didn't have missiles that could hit Japan. But today, North Korea has hundreds of missiles, nuclear weapons, chemical and biological weapons that can hit Japan. The PLA Navy and Coast Guard, since 2012, operates around Japan's claimed territory every day. And if you follow the Chinese response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, you'll have seen that the PLA launched a massive missile salvo into Japan's exclusive economic zone. So with such a direct challenge to Japan, this ban on collective defense, this alibi, is a liability. Japan needs the US in. Japan needs to be able to operate jointly with the US. Japan needs to be able to plan to jointly operate, to do the kind of planning that the US does with Korea or NATO, because we have collective defense. So Abe pushed through a controversial but ultimately successful reinterpretation that locks Japan in. This is huge. What this means is if there's a major crisis, a security crisis, the Japanese prime minister no longer has an alibi. He or she will be expected to consult with the American president or the Australian prime minister on how Japan will join in response to a crisis, even in military ways. So this is a huge change that now reverses what was called the Yoshida Doctrine, the traditional Japanese approach of avoiding precisely that kind of dangerous endeavor. But with the Chinese expansion and with the North Korean threat, that's no longer an option for Tokyo, and Abe pushed that through. Previous governments had tried. It was not new with Abe, but he pushed it through. The other aspect of of external balancing that Abe introduced, it began in the 90s, but Abe really pulled it together as a strategy, was strengthening Japan's partnerships with other powers. And, this includes in particular the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, India grouping. The Quad began when I was in the White House, 2004, the day after Christmas. A massive tsunami struck the Indian Ocean. The US, Japanese, Australian, and Indian navies consulted and said they were ready to put together a joint task force to rescue people across the Indian Ocean. I was in charge of the policy in the White House. The four governments quickly agreed, and that was how the Quad was born, in the midst of a crisis to provide emergency relief. Abe proposed in 2006 that the Quad come back as a summit, as a grouping, quite explicitly, in his view, to deal with China's growing clout and ambitions. But governments poo-pooed it. He came back in 2012 as prime minister, gently reintroduced the idea of the Quad. The Quad was embraced by Donald Trump as a foreign ministers meeting. It was embraced by Joe Biden as a summit. So the big maritime powers coming together to provide a balance of power was a core part of Abe's strategy. It actually goes back to American thinking, Alfred Thayer Mahan and other strategists, but Abe really convinced the other leaders to do it. He convinced Europe to focus not just on China, but on Japan and Australia and allies in the region. He visited every ASEAN capital in Southeast Asia in his first year. He tried very hard and very unsuccessfully to develop a relationship with Putin. So this is all external balancing. He invested in the Indo-Pacific. When China announced Belt and Road, Abe announced the free and open Indo-Pacific, Japanese financing for infrastructure. So investing in Asia, building partnerships with maritime powers, solidifying and really going in with the United States, with Australia and others, and making it clear Japan will play a role if there's a crisis. These were all big changes that strengthened Japan's hand. The interesting thing about this external balancing strategy was Abe never intended to contain or collapse the Chinese Communist Party. From the beginning, he had as his ultimate goal a relationship with China that would be mutually respectful. And he came to power in 2012 after a series of clashes in the East China Sea and elsewhere, where the Japanese government felt quite humiliated by Beijing. Abe intended to reset that relationship from a position of strength. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party went at him in propaganda, put out op-eds. Chinese ambassadors around the world, when Abe came back to power in 2012 and 13, wrote op-eds attacking him as a dangerous nationalist. The Chinese ambassador in London wrote a piece in the Telegraph comparing Abe to Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter and saying he was evil. Abe stuck to his guns, built these external partnerships, changed the constitutional interpretation to work with the U.S., got a standing ovation in the U.S. Congress in the first joint session delivery ever by a Japanese leader. And by 2015-16, Xi Jinping began meeting with him and began taking Japan more seriously. This is really important because right now in the United States, we have embraced, the Biden administration has embraced much of this strategy that Abe introduced, but not the piece about working with China. If you are into US government documents, I used to work on them, I wondered if people ever read them. In February, the White House put out its Indo-Pacific strategy. It talked about much of the strategy I just described as Abe's strategy. But unlike Abe's strategy, it makes no mention of what kind of relationship we'll have with China. This is a lesson we can learn even from a hawkish prime minister like Abe Shinzo, who pursued a strategy that was designed ultimately to have a more productive relationship with China, not to contain China. And what's really quite interesting about this external balancing strategy is how much the rest of the world has embraced it. In 2012, when Abe came to power, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which does really interesting polling of American public views of the world, 2012, the Chicago Council asked the American public 10 years ago, should we be working more with China or should we be working more with Japan and traditional allies? And a plurality of Americans, more Americans than not, said work with China. That's the future. In 2019, after Abe had been in power for 7 years, the Chicago Council asked that question again, and 2/3 of Americans said work with Japan. Now, part of the reason was Xi Jinping, who had a much tougher frankly, coercive stance in Asia than people anticipated. But a lot of it was Abe. Abe was the steady hand in this period, that showed the power of aligning and external balancing. And it is now the core of not only the Biden administration strategy and the Trump administration strategy before it, but here in Australia, in India, and increasingly in Europe and parts of Southeast Asia, you have similar thinking. The other aspect, the third option, to get back to the three choices that international relations scholars argue states have. You can bandwagon with China. Japan's not doing that, although it is under Abe and under Kishida now pursuing as productive a relationship as possible, even though there's tough competition. You can externally balance, which I've described. The third option is to do what scholars call internal balancing, which is strengthening your own power autonomously on your own. You know, a bully shows up in your neighborhood, you go to the gym, you work out a lot, you learn boxing or karate, maybe you get a gun. The pure theorists, the structural realists, argue that the easiest way to do internal balancing, to redress the imbalance and show your own power, is nuclear weapons. And many realists, Henry Kissinger, Herman Kahn, predicted in the past that Japan would, of course, develop nuclear weapons once it had economic power, but Japan hasn't. In polls, consistently over 80% of the Japanese public say they would never support nuclear weapons in Japan, even if neighbors got them. The cultural and political and bureaucratic opposition to nuclear weapons is significant. But there are other ways to do internal balancing. Japan under Abe increased modestly, but increased after decades of decline, spending on defense. Under Abe, Japan began debating what will be featured in Japan's new strategic plan this year. Not just weapons to defend Japan, but weapons to hit other countries, strike capability, cruise missiles that could theoretically, well, that could in fact hit North Korea or China. This is a big change in terms of the capabilities Japan's building militarily. It's going to require very close US-Japan cooperation, because the US military, the US government, we're not going to be happy if a future Japanese government gets in a spat with North Korea and shoots a missile at them, because it's American troops that are on the Korean Peninsula. It's American troops that are in Japan that are going to have to fight that fight. So it's a new era in Japanese capabilities that's going to make a tighter US-Japan alliance and trust even more important. So Abe's modestly increased the defense spending. He opened up a debate we're now seeing come to fruition about new kinds of weapons for Japan that were unheard of when I was a student at Tokyo University. But internal balancing isn't just about things that you deploy or buy, it's about how you organize yourself. And Japan historically has been a very stovepiped society and government. Whereas Brent Scowcroft, the former national security, calls them cylinders of excellence, but stovepipes are inefficient. When bureaucracies are fighting with each other, it's hard to implement a national strategy and to harness and channel all of your national power to achieving peace or diplomacy or deterrence. Abe changed that in pretty dramatic ways. He created a national security council based on the US and British and Australian models and Korean models that would allow the prime minister to have more of a presidential role, not just to be first among the ministers, but to actually, with the cabinet, drive strategy and have the bureaucracies implement it instead of fighting about it. He brought the uniformed military into the prime minister's office to advise him and empower the military. In the East China Sea, the Japanese Coast Guard and the Japanese Navy, the Maritime Self-Defense Forces, were bitter rivals bureaucratically. And the Chinese Coast Guard and Navy were not, and took advantage of that. Well, Abe synced them up. So this organizational aspect of internal balancing is important. And then the other thing Abe had to do was develop new sources of power. Japan's economy is growing at a mature level of 1% or so a year. You can't get more defense, you can't get more development funding, diplomacy if you're not growing the economy. And so that's fundamental to internal balancing, to national power. Abe, I had lunch with Abe in 2013. He'd been in power a bit over a year. And he wanted to talk to me about my experience in the US National Security Council as he developed his own. He told me he spent 70% of his time not on national security per se, not on defense or foreign policy. He spent 70% of his time on the economy. It's the economy, stupid. And part of that was because when he was prime minister the first time in 2006, he ignored the economy and paid the political price. Was forced to resign for a variety of reasons, but mainly because he wasn't delivering for the Japanese people on the economy. So he said he can't get that wrong again. But also his view of Japan as a first-tier power, as a leading power, required economic strength. So he had this idea he called Abenomics, which was a three-pronged effort to restore Japanese economic growth: fiscal stimulus, monetary easing, and restructuring. The monetary easing and the fiscal stimulus are kind of short-term cold medicine or stimulants. The real key to long-term growth is structural reform, is unleashing enterprise and competition in Japan. He did more than any of his predecessors going back 20 years or so. He used his office to argue for more women's empowerment and women's participation in the workforce, because he studied this and knew that if Japanese women had the level of participation in the economy of British or French or American or Australian women, that it would add more productivity, it would grow the economy. So he really made this a theme. He called it womenomics. And he did add about, I think, 3 million women to the workforce, which is a pretty big accomplishment in public policy. And that did contribute to the economy. He also revised and added more competition in the Japanese stock market to make companies invest and get return on investments. Huge reforms in tourism. He essentially tripled tourism in Japan by making it easy to travel there and things like that. You know, these all had some effect. And Abenomics was successful enough that he had public support. You know, the economy grew just enough that he didn't face a pushback. So that's it. The internal balancing and external balancing were critical. Let me end by giving a quick scorecard on how he did. You know, on the external balancing side, the big hole in the donut is the Republic of Korea, South Korea. The Korean Peninsula was historically always the cockpit of Asia, the focus of geopolitical competition by the big powers: Russia, China, Japan, the US. Japanese foreign policy strategy had always been preoccupied with the Korean Peninsula. The Korea-Japan relationship over history issues and other things became so broken that both Seoul and Tokyo just got exhausted with each other. And so the lack of reconciliation between Japan and Korea was a real liability, because Beijing was trying to use that card against Japan, appealing to the Korean sense of grievance against China, that of course, against Japan, which of course many Chinese share. Abe could have done more, and he kept things from deteriorating, but could have done more. There's a new government in Seoul under Mr. Yoon that is more favorably disposed to Japan. Kishida's making some effort, but this remains a real liability for the external balancing strategy of partnering with others. On the internal balancing side, the womenomics was initially successful, but bringing that many women into the workforce required infrastructure for daycare, changed norms in the workplace, and there's been backsliding. It's been more challenging to get to the next phase than Abe would have anticipated. And overall, on the domestic side, with a declining birth rate, Japan's population started shrinking. A lot of economists think these reforms he did were not enough, that Japan's going to have to really restructure and grow in new ways. And Abe didn't quite get there, and Kishida's not quite getting there. So it was not a perfect strategy. It was hampered by a lack of ambition on the economic side, and a little bit of a lack of imagination on the foreign policy side, particularly how Japan thinks about history. We can talk about that. Abe issued a statement as prime minister on the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in 2015 in August. It was the longest and most in-depth apology and statement of remorse by any Japanese prime minister. If you compare it to statements by German chancellors, it actually is longer and more in-depth. Abe said it was the last apology, and he wanted to move beyond the post-war controversies and in a realpolitik way deny China the right to use this history card against Japan as Japan tries to organize the rest of the region, Europe and the US, to deal with a more difficult China. And you know, on a political and foreign policy level, he succeeded. Most of the region accepted his apology. China and Korea had more difficulty, but most of Southeast Asia, all of Europe and North America, you know, Australia fought bitter war with Japan, accepted and welcomed his statement. But that was a political statement and it was a diplomatic statement. And ultimately, this is going to take more effort on a society-to-society level. So there are areas where Abe's successors have work to do. But his strategy is the strategy for Japan, broadly speaking. There's no major political figure arguing for something different. The real question now is, can his successors implement it, close in the gaps? And as I said, it's a strategy that has shaped how American governments and Australian governments are thinking about the rise of China. And I think we'll continue to do so. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. There's a lot in there to think about, both Abe as a person and a politician, Japan's role in Asia, how the US, Japan, and others interpret China's rise. A lot in there. I look forward to the questions, and I'm going to turn it back to Professor Dale to moderate if I understand correctly. Thank you.